The boy in the photograph was missing his front tooth on the left side. He was wearing a striped t-shirt his mother had sewn from a pattern in a McCall's magazine, and he was holding a stuffed brown rabbit by one ear, in the way small children hold things they have decided are permanent. The photograph was taken on the morning of June 8, 1978, in the backyard of a small, white-frame house on Hollow Branch Road in Letcher County, Kentucky. The boy's name was Lucas Hart. He was 5 years old. By that evening he was gone, and for the next 46 years his mother kept that photograph in a silver frame on the mantel above the wood stove, and every morning when she came downstairs she touched the glass with 2 fingers and said his name out loud, the same way her own mother had taught her to say grace at the table. That is not a story about a child who wandered off into the hills of eastern Kentucky and was lost to the woods. That is a story about a man who climbed onto a porch in the warm June dusk and lifted a sleeping boy from his crib while his family was hanging laundry in the side yard. And about the woman who never once, in 46 years, allowed herself to believe her son was dead, and it would take a sheriff's deputy in a town more than 900 miles away. A single question asked of a 51-year-old man with no memory of his early childhood. And a DNA test the man agreed to only because his wife begged him to finally bring Lucas Hart home. But before any of that, we have to go back to the summer of 1978, because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Lucas Hart was and the small green hollow he was taken from. It was the first week of June, 1978. One of those eastern Kentucky summers when the dogwoods had finished their bloom and the kudzu had begun its slow green march up the telephone poles along Route 7. The air in the hollows smelled of honeysuckle and damp creekstone, and the faint, sweet rot of last year's leaves still working themselves into the ground beneath the poplars. Jimmy Carter was in the White House. A gallon of gas cost 63 cents at the Phillips 66 station up on the main road. The CB radios crackled in the cabs of pickup trucks all the way from Whitesburg to Hazard, truckers calling out road conditions in voices that crackled with static and coal dust. Letcher County in 1978 was a place where the coal trucks came down the mountain at 5 in the morning, and the women on Hollow Branch Road knew it was time to put the coffee on by the sound of the air brakes hissing at the bottom of the grade. The community of Bear Fork sat at the end of a county road that turned to gravel a mile before the last mailbox. Population not quite 300. The kind of place where the doors stayed unlocked at night because nobody could remember a reason they should be locked. And where on summer evenings the children ran barefoot in the side yards until the lightning bugs came out and their mothers called them in. The Hart family lived in the smallest house on Hollow Branch Road. Daniel Hart was 28 years old, a coal miner at the No. 4 mine just over the county line. The kind of soft-spoken man who came home black-faced from the shift and washed up in a galvanized tub on the back porch because his wife wouldn't have coal dust in her kitchen. Ruth Hart was 26. She had been a Sunday school teacher at Pine Creek Baptist before the children came, and she still kept a Bible on the windowsill above the sink with a pressed dogwood petal marking the book of Ruth. They had 2 children. Sarah was 7, dark-haired like her father, already reading 2 grades above her level. Lucas was 5. He had been born on the morning of a snowstorm in February of 1973. The doctor having driven up the mountain in chains on his tires, and from his first breath, he had been the kind of child who laughed before he learned how to cry. He had a cowlick that no comb could fix. He had been given a stuffed brown rabbit by his grandmother on his 2nd birthday, and had carried it everywhere since. The rabbit's left ear gone soft and gray from being held in his small fist for 3 years straight. He called the rabbit Brown. He had lost his front tooth on the left side 3 weeks before the photograph was taken, knocked out by a fall from the lowest branch of the maple tree in the side yard, and Ruth had wrapped the tooth in tissue paper and put it in a small glass jar in the kitchen drawer. He wanted to be a coal truck driver when he grew up. The morning of June 8, 1978, was the last morning Ruth Hart would ever brush her son's hair. That afternoon, Ruth had begun the week's washing. The sky had been clear all day. By 5:30 p.m., she had 2 lines strung between the porch posts and the maple tree, and Sarah was helping her hang the sheets with wooden clothespins from a coffee can. Lucas had been playing in the side yard with Brown the rabbit, and at 5:45 Ruth had carried him inside, kicked off his small canvas shoes at the door, and laid him in the crib in the back bedroom for his evening nap. He was asleep before she pulled the door to. The crib was directly beneath an open window. The window opened onto the back porch. The back porch faced the woods. At 6:10 p.m., Daniel came home from the day shift and stopped at the side yard to help Ruth take down the dry sheets. They worked together for 14 minutes. At 6:24, Ruth went inside to start supper. At 6:31, she walked into the back bedroom to wake Lucas, and the crib was empty. Brown the rabbit was lying on the floor beneath the open window. There was a single small footprint in the soft black dirt of the flower bed outside the window, larger than a child's foot. An adult's footprint, pointed away from the house. Ruth stood at the empty crib for what she would later say felt like an hour, but had been perhaps 4 seconds. Then she screamed for Daniel. Daniel came running. Sarah came running. Within 20 minutes, the entire community of Bear Fork was in the Hart's yard. By midnight, there were 60 men in the woods behind the house with lanterns and shotguns and bloodhounds the next county had sent over without being asked. They walked the hollow, grid by grid. They followed the creek down for 2 miles. They climbed the ridge behind the house and walked all the way to the strip mine cut on the far side. By the 3rd morning, the state police had arrived. By the 5th day, 300 volunteers had searched every inch of woods within 4 miles of the house. They found a piece of red string near a fallen log. They found nothing else. There was no body. There were no tracks past the gravel road. Lucas Hart had been lifted from a crib in a small Kentucky house at the supper hour on a Thursday in June, and the world had closed over him like water. The detective who took the case was a Kentucky State Police investigator named Hollis Whitaker, out of the Hazard Post, 38 years old. A hill countryman who had grown up 4 counties over and who took the photograph of Lucas in the striped shirt and carried it folded in his wallet for the next 27 years. He worked the case from his desk for a decade and from his garage for nearly 2 decades after that. In the first 90 days, he interviewed every adult male in Bear Fork and the 4 surrounding hollows. He looked hard at a drifter who had been seen walking the railroad tracks 2 days before the disappearance. But the man was found 2 weeks later in a flophouse in Knoxville and had alibis from a soup kitchen line. He looked hard at a recently fired employee from the mine who had argued with Daniel Hart about a shift change. But the man had been at his sister's house in Pikeville the entire evening, with 7 witnesses. The case file documents what Whitaker himself wrote in a 1980 memo to his lieutenant. This boy was not lost. This boy was taken. By whom and to where, I cannot tell you. The early investigators had also been told something Ruth Hart had only mentioned once and never repeated. In the weeks before Lucas disappeared, a tan station wagon with out-of-state plates had been seen 3 different times parked at the pull-off down by the creek, where the gravel road met Route 7. A woman had been driving. A man had been in the passenger seat. They had not gotten out of the car. They had simply sat there in the late afternoons, watching the road. The witness who reported it had been an elderly farmer named Carl Begley, who had been driving his tractor up the road and had noticed the car twice in 1 week and a 3rd time a few days later. Carl Begley died of a heart attack in November of 1978, 5 months after Lucas disappeared. His report was in the file. No one followed up on it. The State Police Review in 1982 noted the lead and noted that it could not now be pursued. The plates had not been recorded. The descriptions of the man and woman were vague. Ruth Hart had told the original officers about the station wagon on the night of June 8th, and she would tell every detective who came through her kitchen for the next 46 years, and every one of them would write it down, and none of them would ever find that car. By the end of 1979, the official conclusion of the Letcher County Sheriff's Department was that Lucas Hart had likely wandered into the woods and met with misadventure. The Harts were told, gently, that they should consider holding a memorial service. They did not. Ruth Hart kept Lucas's room exactly as it had been on the evening of June 8th, 1978. The crib stayed in the back bedroom for 19 years, until 1997, when Daniel finally moved it to the attic at her request, because she had begun to dream that Lucas was sleeping in it again, and the dreams were destroying her. Brown the rabbit stayed on the dresser. The small canvas shoes stayed in the cupboard by the back door. Ruth kept brushing Sarah's hair every morning for the next 11 years until Sarah left for nursing school, and after Sarah left, Ruth would sometimes stand at the kitchen sink in the early morning and brush the air where her son should have been. Daniel kept working the mine. He stopped speaking, mostly. He developed a cough in 1986 that the company doctors said was nothing, and that he died from in 1994 at the age of 44. With his daughter holding one of his hands and his wife holding the other, and the third hand he had been waiting for never arriving. Detective Hollis Whitaker retired in 2001, but kept the case file in a green metal cabinet in his garage and pulled it out every June 8th until his stroke in 2019. Sarah Hart became a pediatric nurse in Lexington and never had children of her own. She told a friend once, in the hospital break room over coffee, that she had been afraid to. The community of Bear Fork held a candlelight vigil at the gravel turnaround on June 8th every single year. 60 people came in 1979. 40 came in 1985. 12 came in 2010. 3 came in 2022. Ruth, Sarah, and an elderly woman named Maureen Caudill, who had been Ruth's best friend since the 7th grade, and who said only that she would keep coming as long as her legs would carry her up the road. Ruth Hart was 72 years old in the summer of 2024. She still touched the photograph on the mantel every morning. She still said his name. She had not, in 46 years, ever once said the word dead in connection with her son. Every case in this channel takes weeks of careful research, going through court records, original case files, and giving real people the story they deserved the first time. If that work matters to you, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Now, let's get back to Lucas. In April of 2024, a sheriff's deputy in Bend, Oregon, named Marisol Reyes, was making a routine welfare check on an elderly woman whose neighbors had called the non-emergency line because they had not seen her in 3 days. The woman, an 84-year-old retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Vance, was found dead in her armchair of what the coroner would determine to be natural causes. Deputy Reyes stayed at the house for the standard procedural duties, securing the property, contacting next of kin. There was one next of kin listed on the emergency contact card in the kitchen drawer. A son, name, David Vance. Age 51. Address, a small ranch property 40 miles east of Bend. Deputy Reyes drove out that afternoon to deliver the news. David Vance answered the door. He was a quiet, soft-spoken man, a heavy equipment operator at a construction yard in Bend, married to a kindergarten teacher named Annie, father of 3 grown children. No criminal record beyond a parking ticket in 1998. He took the news of his mother's death with a controlled grief of a man who had been expecting it for some time. Deputy Reyes sat with him in his kitchen for nearly an hour while he made the phone calls to his children. And toward the end of that hour, while looking at the framed photographs on the mantel, David Vance and Annie at their wedding. David Vance with his 3 children at a lake. Deputy Reyes noticed something she could not at first explain. There was no photograph of David Vance as a small child. There were photographs of him as a teenager, in his Boy Scout uniform, at his high school graduation. There were none from before he was about 10 years old. She did not say anything that afternoon. But she was a careful person, and the absence stayed with her. 2 weeks later, working through the formal closing of Eleanor Vance's estate, Deputy Reyes found a birth certificate for David Vance in a safety deposit box at the bank. It listed him as born on June 11, 1973, in Portland, Oregon. The hospital that was listed on the certificate did not exist. It had never existed. Deputy Reyes pulled up the NAMUS database that evening at her desk. She entered the parameters of a missing 5-year-old boy from June of 1978, male, blonde, blue-eyed. She got 11 results. The third one was Lucas Hart. The photograph in the file was a boy in a striped t-shirt, missing his front tooth on the left side, holding a stuffed brown rabbit by one ear. Deputy Reyes sat at her desk for a long time looking at it. Then she opened her phone and looked at David Vance's driver's license photo, which she had taken with her own camera the day she had delivered the news of his mother's death. She looked at the 2 photographs side by side. The man and the boy had the same cowlick. The process that would follow was patient and quiet. Deputy Reyes contacted the Kentucky State Police. They contacted Sarah Hart. Sarah agreed to submit a DNA sample. David Vance, when approached 3 weeks later by Deputy Reyes and a detective from Kentucky, listened to what they were telling him with the calm of a man hearing a story about someone else. He had no memory before his 8th birthday. His mother had told him he had been sick as a small child and had lost the early years to fever. He agreed to the DNA test only because his wife Annie, sitting beside him at the kitchen table, took his hand and said, "Please." The results came back 6 weeks later. The probability of biological relation between David Vance and Sarah Hart, full siblings, was greater than 99.99%. The story that emerged over the following months was the one Ruth Hart had told every detective for 46 years and never been believed. Eleanor Vance had been 34 years old in the summer of 1978, recently widowed, infertile, living in a rented house in southern Indiana with her second husband, a long-haul trucker named Roy Vance, who had a route that took him through eastern Kentucky on the regular run from the West Virginia coalfields to the Ohio River barges. Roy Vance had died of a stroke in 1991. Eleanor had taken the boy and moved to Oregon in October of 1978, 4 months after Lucas disappeared, telling her new neighbors that her late husband had left her with a small son to raise alone. The tan station wagon parked at the pull-off where the gravel road met Route 7 had belonged to Roy Vance's brother in West Virginia. The state police were able to confirm this from old DMV records when they finally knew what to look for. There would be no arrest. Eleanor Vance was beyond the reach of any earthly court. Roy Vance had been dead for 33 years. But the small Kentucky town of Bear Fork would gather in the gravel turnaround at the end of Hollow Branch Road on the evening of August 14, 2024, when a 51-year-old man named David Vance, whose true name had been spoken every morning for 46 years on a porch 1,000 miles east, came home for the first time since he had been carried out of his mother's bedroom in the warm June dusk. Ruth Hart stood in the front yard. Sarah stood beside her. Maureen Cadell stood beside Sarah. David Vance got out of the rental car. He was a tall man with a soft voice and gray at his temples. He did not know what to say. Ruth Hart walked across the yard, slowly, because her hip was bad now, and she stopped in front of him and looked up at his face for a long time. Then she reached up and touched his cowlick with 2 fingers, the way she had touched the photograph every morning for 46 years. She said only his name. He did not remember her. He had no memory of the woman who had brushed his hair on the morning of June 8, 1978, and no memory of the rabbit named Brown still sitting on a dresser in a back bedroom of the small white frame house behind them. But he stayed for a week. Annie came out from Oregon with their 3 children. Sarah moved back home for the month. The 5 of them ate supper at Ruth's kitchen table every evening, and Ruth told her son and her grandchildren the story of a child who had laughed before he learned how to cry, who had lost his front tooth in the maple tree, who had wanted to be a coal truck driver. And whether or not David Vance ever came to remember Lucas Hart in the way his mother remembered him, he came to know that he had been loved across 46 years by a woman who had never once let go of his name. Lucas Hart was 5 years old in the photograph on the mantel. He was wearing a striped t-shirt his mother had sewn from a magazine pattern. He was missing his front tooth on the left side, and he was holding Brown the rabbit by one ear in the way small children hold things they have decided are permanent. His mother kept that photograph in a silver frame on the mantel above the wood stove for 46 years. She touched the glass with 2 fingers every morning. She said his name. She kept his small canvas shoes in the cupboard by the back door. She refused, against the gentle counsel of every well-meaning friend who had ever sat in her kitchen, against the resigned conclusions of every officer who had ever closed his notebook in her living room, against the slow erosion of 46 Kentucky summers, to ever once believe that her son was dead. And she was right. How many other children, taken from their families in the long years before national missing children registries and DINA databases existed, are right now living adult lives somewhere in this country under names that were never theirs, with no memory of where they came from? What does it mean for justice when the people responsible for a child's taking are long beyond the reach of any court that could punish them, but the child himself is still alive, and his mother is still living to touch his face? And what do we owe the mothers who refuse to be talked out of the truth? Justice, of a kind, came for Lucas Hart after 46 years. Stories like his remind us that the truth, however late, however quietly it arrives at a kitchen door in eastern Kentucky on a warm August evening, always finds its way home. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.